Imagine a world without modern countries. No airplanes, no electricity, no modern armies. Instead, powerful kingdoms controlled vast territories, merchants carried goods across the Mediterranean, and ships connected distant civilizations. Around 3,200 years ago, this ancient world appeared remarkably powerful. Egypt was ruled by pharaohs. The Hittites controlled much of Anatolia. Mycenaean kingdoms dominated parts of Greece. Great cities flourished across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes carried copper, tin, gold, pottery, grain, and luxury goods across enormous distances. It was a connected world. But then, something began to go wrong. Within a relatively short period around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century BCE, many important centers were destroyed, abandoned, or severely weakened. Historians call this period the Bronze Age collapse. And the mystery is not simply why one kingdom fell. The real mystery is why so many societies began to struggle around the same time. Welcome to History Uncovered. To understand the collapse, we first need to understand the world that existed before it. The Bronze Age world. The Late Bronze Age was an age of powerful kingdoms. One of the greatest was the Hittite Empire. Based in Anatolia, roughly modern-day Turkey, the Hittites controlled a large territory and competed directly with Egypt for influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Their capital was Hadusa. Massive walls surrounded the city. Palaces and temples stood inside. And clay tablets recorded treaties, religious rituals, laws, and diplomatic correspondence. The Hittites were not isolated. They were part of an international system. Egypt was another major power. The pharaohs controlled one of the world's most organized states. Egyptian armies fought in Syria and Canaan. Its rulers exchanged gifts with foreign kings. And its wealth depended partly on the trade networks connecting the Mediterranean and Near East. Farther west were the Mycenaean Greeks. Their centers included Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These kingdoms built fortified citadels and maintained complex administrative systems. Their society was highly organized. Palaces controlled agriculture, trade, weapons, and resources. And like the Hittites and Egyptians, they depended on a wider economic network. Then there were the cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Places such as Ugarit became important trading centers. Ships moved between ports. Merchants carried metals and luxury goods. The entire system depended on one crucial thing: connection. And that connection was also its greatest weakness. The Bronze Age economy. Bronze sounds simple, but producing it required international trade. Bronze is primarily made by combining copper and tin. The problem was that these resources were not always found in the same place. Copper could be obtained from several regions, including Cyprus. Tin sources were more distant and less evenly distributed. This meant that kingdoms depended on merchants and long-distance trade. A disruption in one region could create problems somewhere hundreds of miles away. If ships stopped sailing, if roads became dangerous, if a city stopped producing grain, the effects could spread. The ancient world was connected, but it was also fragile. Signs of trouble. By the late 13th century BCE, evidence of instability began appearing across the region. Some settlements were destroyed. Others were abandoned. Fortifications became more important. And written records began describing uncertainty. One of the most famous examples comes from Ugarit. Letters discovered there reveal a kingdom facing serious danger. One message describes enemy ships approaching. Another desperate communication asks for help. And then, the written record from Ugarit suddenly stops. The city was destroyed around the early 12th century BCE. Its ruins were never immediately rebuilt. But Ugarit was only one piece of a much larger story. Earthquakes and destruction. One possible explanation for some of the destruction is natural disaster. The Eastern Mediterranean lies in a region where earthquakes are common. Archaeologists have found evidence of destruction that may have resulted from earthquakes at several ancient sites. But earthquakes alone cannot explain everything. A destroyed city can sometimes be rebuilt. An earthquake does not automatically destroy an entire international trade system. Something more complicated appears to have been happening. Climate and famine. Another possibility was climate change. Evidence from different regions suggests that parts of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced periods of drought around this time. Less rainfall meant less agricultural production. Less grain meant higher pressure on already stressed societies. And when harvests failed repeatedly, famine could follow. A kingdom with a strong economy might survive one bad year. But several years of drought could create a much more dangerous situation. Farmers could abandon their land. People could migrate. Governments could lose tax revenue. Armies could become harder to supply. And desperate populations could begin moving toward regions where food was more available. The ancient world may have been entering a cycle of crisis. The Sea Peoples. Then another mysterious group appears in the historical record. The Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III describe groups arriving by land and sea. The Egyptians fought them, and the inscriptions present the conflict as a major threat to Egypt. But there is an important warning here. We do not actually know exactly who all the Sea Peoples were. They were not necessarily one unified nation. The term refers to several groups mentioned in Egyptian records. They may have included migrants, warriors, displaced populations, or a mixture of different peoples. Their origins remain debated. But their appearance tells us something important. Large movements of people were occurring during a period of instability, and migration can place enormous pressure on already weakened kingdoms. The domino effect. Imagine what happens when one part of a connected system begins to fail. A drought reduces harvests. Food becomes expensive. Merchants face danger. Trade decreases. Metal supplies become harder to obtain. Armies become difficult to maintain. Cities become vulnerable. A kingdom falls. Its neighbors lose an important trading partner. Their economies suffer. Another city becomes unstable. And eventually, the entire system begins to break apart. This may be one of the most important ideas behind the Bronze Age collapse. There may never have been one single cause. Instead, several crises may have collided. Climate stress, famine, earthquakes, war, migration, political instability, and the breakdown of long-distance trade. Together, they created a crisis far larger than any individual kingdom could easily control. The first falls. The Mycenaean world began to experience major disruption. Palace centers were destroyed. Some were abandoned. The sophisticated administrative system that had controlled Mycenaean kingdoms weakened dramatically. The Hittite Empire suffered an even greater collapse. Around the early 12th century BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. The empire that had once challenged Egypt disappeared as a major political power. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, other settlements also suffered destruction. The old international system was breaking. But Egypt survived. And that survival would place Pharaoh Ramesses III at the center of one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire period. Around 1177 BCE, Egyptian forces fought groups identified in inscriptions as the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians claimed victory. But Egypt itself was already under enormous pressure. The world around it was collapsing. And the pharaoh could not simply restore the old system. The age of great Bronze Age kingdoms was coming to an end. Cities were falling. Trade networks were shrinking. Palaces were disappearing. And across the Mediterranean, a civilization that had lasted for centuries was entering one of the most dramatic transformations in ancient history. But what exactly caused the final collapse? Were the sea peoples really responsible? Did climate change trigger the crisis? Did earthquakes destroy the cities? Or was the real cause something much more complicated? The answer may be that all of these forces played a role. And in part 2, we will follow the final breakdown of the Bronze Age world, the fall of the great kingdoms, the survival of Egypt, and the strange new era that emerged from the ruins. The ancient world was not simply destroyed. It was transformed. And from its ashes, a new age began. The old world was already breaking apart. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities had been destroyed, kingdoms had weakened, and the trade networks that connected them were beginning to disappear. But the collapse was not finished. The greatest question remained. What happened after the great kingdoms fell? The end of the Hittites. One of the most dramatic losses was the Hittite Empire. For centuries, the Hittites had been one of the most powerful states in the ancient Near East. They had fought Egypt. They had controlled major trade routes. And their capital, Hadusa, had been a center of political power. But around the beginning of the 12th century BCE, the Hittite imperial system collapsed. Hadusa was abandoned. The empire disappeared as a major political power. Smaller kingdoms later survived in parts of Anatolia and northern Syria, but the great Hittite state was gone. And this was significant because the Hittites were not a small kingdom. Their disappearance left a massive political vacuum. The Mycenaean collapse. Greece experienced its own transformation. The great Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. The administrative system based around these palaces disappeared. Writing in the Linear B script stopped being used for administration. Long-distance trade declined. And the highly organized palace economy fragmented. The world of Mycenaean kings was fading. But the people themselves did not simply disappear. Communities survived. They adapted. They moved. And over generations, a different society began to emerge. This is one of the most important lessons of the Bronze Age collapse. Civilizations can disappear without their people disappearing. Political systems can collapse while cultures continue in new forms. Egypt survives. Egypt faced the same crisis but survived. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egyptian forces fought groups identified in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. The famous inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the conflict as a major victory. Egypt survived the attacks. But survival came at a cost. The Egyptian state was already under economic pressure. Its influence outside Egypt weakened. Its resources were strained. And the international system that had once supported its power was disappearing. Egypt had survived the collapse. But it could not restore the old world. The trade network breaks. This may have been one of the most important parts of the entire crisis. The Bronze Age world depended on trade. Copper, tin, gold, grain, timber, luxury goods. Ships carried these resources between distant kingdoms. When major cities fell, the network became harder to maintain. If merchants could no longer travel safely, trade declined. If trade declined, governments lost resources. If governments lost resources, armies and administrations became weaker. And when several major centers collapsed at the same time, the entire system became increasingly difficult to repair. It was not simply the destruction of cities. It was the breakdown of the connections between them. Did the Sea Peoples cause the collapse? For centuries, the Sea Peoples were presented as the great villains of the story. A mysterious force that appeared from the sea, destroyed civilizations, and brought down the Bronze Age. But history is rarely that simple. The Sea Peoples may have contributed to the destruction and instability. But there is no strong evidence that they alone caused the entire collapse. They may themselves have been victims of the same crisis. Imagine populations leaving their homes because of famine, war, economic collapse, or political instability. Some become migrants. Some become warriors. Some travel by sea. And eventually, outsiders see them as an invading force. This possibility makes the story even more complicated. The Sea Peoples may not have been the beginning of the crisis. They may have been one of its consequences. The climate question. Climate may also have played a role. Periods of drought could have reduced harvests across parts of the Mediterranean. When food becomes scarce, societies become vulnerable. But climate alone cannot explain every destroyed city. That is why many historians and archaeologists increasingly look at the collapse as a multi-cause crisis. Climate stress, famine, political instability, earthquakes, war, migration, trade disruption. Each factor could make the others worse. It may have been a chain reaction. Not one disaster, but many crises happening together. A new world emerges. By the centuries after the collapse, the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean looked very different. The great palace kingdoms were gone. The Hittite Empire had disappeared. Mycenaean palace civilization had collapsed. Long-distance trade had weakened. Many cities had been abandoned. But humanity did not vanish. New communities appeared. New political powers developed. New technologies and military systems spread. And eventually, the ancient world entered a new historical era. In Greece, the centuries that followed are sometimes called the Greek Dark Age. Writing disappeared for a time. Population declined in some areas. But this period did not last forever. Centuries later, Greek cities would rise again. Athens and Sparta would become powerful. Greek art and philosophy would flourish. And the civilizations that emerged would eventually influence the entire Mediterranean world. The beginning of the Iron Age. Perhaps the most important transformation was technological. The Iron Age gradually replaced the Bronze Age as iron became increasingly important for tools and weapons. Iron was more widely available than tin. And as ironworking techniques improved, societies became less dependent on the international supply networks required for bronze production. This did not happen overnight, but it marked the beginning of a new era. The old Bronze Age world had depended heavily on centralized palaces and long-distance trade. The emerging Iron Age world would be different. New kingdoms would rise. New military powers would appear. And eventually, civilizations such as the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans would dominate the ancient world. So why did the Bronze Age collapse? There is no single answer. And that may be the most important conclusion. The Bronze Age collapse was probably not caused by one mysterious army. It was not simply one earthquake. It was not simply climate change. And it was not simply famine. Instead, several pressures appear to have collided. A changing climate may have damaged agriculture. Food shortages may have caused migration. Migration and warfare may have destabilized kingdoms. Earthquakes may have destroyed important cities. Political instability may have weakened governments. And the collapse of trade may have made recovery even harder. Each crisis made the next one more dangerous, until the system could no longer hold itself together. The great lesson. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us something that goes far beyond ancient history. Powerful civilizations can appear permanent. Their cities can look unstoppable. Their armies can seem invincible. Their economies can appear too interconnected to fail. But complex systems can also be fragile. When too many parts fail at the same time, even great civilizations can be transformed. The people survive. The culture survives. But the world they knew may never return. More than 3,000 years ago, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced one of history's greatest transformations. Kingdoms disappeared. Cities fell silent. Trade routes broke apart. And an old world gave way to a new one. But from those ruins came new societies, new technologies, new kingdoms, and eventually some of the civilizations that would shape the ancient world for centuries to come. The Bronze Age did not simply end. It gave way to something new. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of the story. History is not always about civilizations disappearing. Sometimes, it is about what humanity builds after they fall. This was the story of the Bronze Age collapse. A world that seemed powerful. A system that slowly broke apart. And a new age that rose from its ruins. Thank you for watching History Uncovered. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten turning points that shaped our world, subscribe for more historical stories.